It started as a bold move, the kind of headline that makes waves across the world. 50% tariffs on imported aluminum, a shock to the global market. A clear signal from Donald Trump that the United States would no longer play by what he saw as unfair trade rules. "We're bringing jobs back," he promised. "We're protecting American workers." And for a while, that's exactly what people wanted to hear. Factories in the heartland heard the news and cheered. Aluminum smelters that had been running at half capacity started talking about reopening full shifts. Workers who had been laid off months earlier thought they might finally be getting their jobs back. On television, analysts debated how the move would reshape global trade. To Trump supporters, it was a masterstroke, a president putting his own people first, no matter what the rest of the world thought. But tariffs are like a storm. You can feel the first gust of wind and think you know what's coming, but you don't see the damage until it's already too late. And for American aluminum, the damage came fast. Within weeks, the cost of aluminum in the US shot through the roof. Not just for foreign suppliers, but for everyone. American companies that bought aluminum to make products, automakers, beer can manufacturers, construction firms, aerospace companies suddenly found their costs exploding. They couldn't just eat those costs, they had to pass them on. Cars got more expensive. Soda and beer prices crept upward. Construction budgets went over their limits. Small manufacturers who relied on cheap aluminum were forced to cut hours, delay projects, or shut down entirely. The same tariff that was supposed to save American jobs was now putting a whole new set of them at risk. The problem wasn't just the price. Foreign countries hit back fast. The European Union, Canada, China, and others slapped their own tariffs on US goods in retaliation. American farmers suddenly found their exports blocked or taxed so heavily that they couldn't compete overseas. The pain spread from aluminum plants to soybean fields, from car factories to small-town diners, and then came the layoffs. At first, it was a trickle. A factory here, a supplier there, but within months, it turned into a flood. Over 100 American workers, welders, machinists, drivers, warehouse staff found themselves out of a job. In towns where a single aluminum-related plant was the main employer, the layoffs hit like a hurricane. Businesses that had nothing to do with aluminum started closing too. Because when workers lose their paychecks, they stop spending. The anger grew. At campaign rallies, Trump doubled down, saying the tariffs were necessary and that short-term pain would lead to long-term gain. But for the families who were packing up their belongings because they couldn't pay rent anymore, the long-term didn't matter. They needed jobs now. The White House insisted the policy was about national security, arguing that the US couldn't afford to rely on foreign countries for critical materials. And on paper, that argument made sense. Aluminum is used in everything from fighter jets to power lines. In a crisis, depending on another country's supply could be dangerous. But in reality, the tariff didn't create new American aluminum production. It just made everything more expensive. Even the aluminum smelters that had supported the policy in the beginning started to feel the pressure. Their costs for raw materials and energy climbed. Foreign buyers canceled orders because US aluminum was now too expensive compared to alternatives from Australia, Russia, or the Middle East. The same plants that had been hiring after the tariff announcement were now scaling back. It wasn't just an economic story, it was political. Trump's opponents called the tariff a failure, a classic case of a policy that sounded strong but ignored the complexity of global trade. His supporters argued that the real problem was foreign retaliation and that standing firm was the only way to force other countries to play fair. The debate played out on news channels, in Congress, and in union halls across the country. Meanwhile, the numbers didn't lie. US aluminum exports had collapsed by more than half. Import prices had soared. The domestic industry was still struggling, and entire sectors that depended on aluminum were bleeding jobs. It was exactly the kind of backfire that critics had warned about, but by the time it was clear, reversing course would be politically costly. The fallout spread far beyond aluminum. Farmers lost markets in Asia. Whiskey makers in Kentucky found their exports to Europe crushed by retaliatory tariffs. Motorcycle manufacturers, construction equipment companies, and electronics producers all saw sharp declines. Economists began talking about a tariff ripple, where one sector's pain cascades into others, creating a chain reaction of losses. In some cities, the frustration boiled over into protests. Workers marched with signs demanding the tariffs be lifted. Others targeted foreign governments, calling on them to drop their retaliation. But the tension wasn't just between countries, it was between Americans themselves. Smelter workers, who had initially been excited about the tariffs, now found themselves at odds with auto workers, brewers, and builders whose jobs had been gutted by the policy. For Trump, the aluminum tariff became a test of political will. Would he stick to his guns despite the growing fallout, or admit the policy had hurt more than it helped? In typical fashion, he framed it as a fight, a necessary battle to protect America from being exploited by foreign powers. But the reality on the ground was messier, filled with people whose livelihoods were caught in the middle. The longer the tariff stayed in place, the more complicated the situation became. U.S. allies were signing trade deals with each other, cutting America out of key markets. Foreign aluminum producers found new customers. Supply chains shifted in ways that couldn't easily be reversed. Even if the tariffs were lifted tomorrow, it would take years to rebuild the trust and business relationships that had been broken. And here's the part that made economists nervous. Tariffs can create lasting damage to an economy's structure. Once businesses adapt to new realities, even bad ones, they often don't go back. If a Canadian car manufacturer learns to buy aluminum from Norway instead of the US, they might stick with that supplier forever. That means lost sales for American producers even after the political dust settles. For the workers, the numbers were personal. 100,000 layoffs isn't just a statistic, it's 100,000 families. Parents telling their kids they can't afford the school trip this year. Couples putting off buying a house. Retirements delayed. Medical bills piling up because health insurance vanished with the job. Some workers tried to retrain, moving into different industries. But in many small towns, there simply weren't other jobs to be had. People moved away, leaving behind empty houses and shuttered storefronts. The kind of slow-motion collapse that can hollow out a community for decades. In Washington, the tariff became a political football, tossed back and forth between rival factions. Lawmakers, particularly those representing states with heavily impacted industries, urgently proposed targeted relief measures. They argued that, while the tariff's intention might have been to protect steel and aluminum producers, the fallout from retaliatory tariffs was decimating other critical sectors, from agriculture to manufacturing. They advocated for special exemptions and subsidies to help companies and farmers who were losing foreign markets or facing a sharp rise in the cost of raw materials. These politicians saw their role as mitigating the collateral damage of a policy that, while popular with some, was causing tangible harm to their constituents. On the other side of the aisle, a powerful contingent pushed for a complete and immediate rollback of the tariffs. They championed the principles of free trade and globalization, asserting that open markets, not protectionist walls, were the true engine of American prosperity. They pointed to economic models and historical data, warning that tariffs were a self-inflicted wound that would lead to higher prices for consumers and a loss of global competitiveness. Yet, President Trump remained unyielding. He publicly rebuked his critics, branding them as weak and short-sighted for not standing up to foreign countries he accused of taking advantage of the United States. His defiant stance was a key part of his political brand, a willingness to challenge the global status quo regardless of the blowback. Meanwhile, the media's coverage of the event was as divided as the political landscape. Depending on the outlet's editorial leanings, the story was framed in vastly different ways to appeal to their respective audiences. Outlets supportive of Trump's agenda heralded the tariff as a sign of his unwavering commitment to American workers, a bold move to rebalance an unfair global playing field. They showcased factory workers who felt their jobs were being protected, portraying the action as a necessary step against a corrupt system. Conversely, news organizations critical of the administration depicted the tariff as a textbook case of economic self-sabotage, a reckless policy that prioritized a political talking point over sound economic principles. They highlighted the stories of businesses struggling with increased costs and the consumers who would ultimately bear the burden. For the vast majority of everyday Americans, however, the dueling headlines and political posturing were just noise. They weren't concerned with the intricacies of economic theory, or the political motivations of lawmakers. Their reality was far more immediate. They cared about the rising price of cars, household appliances, and even aluminum beverage cans. They worried about the stability of their jobs in industries now struggling with new costs or lost export markets. The political rhetoric and media framing for them were irrelevant. What mattered was the tangible effect on their wallets and their livelihoods. The tariff saga, at its core, was a profound demonstration of how political gambits, no matter how they are framed or debated, ultimately come down to the lived experience of ordinary people trying to get by. Months into the crisis, the numbers showed no sign of improving. Aluminum prices remained high. Exports stayed low. Retaliatory tariffs on American goods were still in place, and the layoffs kept coming. The question was no longer whether the tariff had backfired, it was how much damage it would leave behind. The implementation of the 50% aluminum tariff serves as a stark reminder of the intricate connections within the modern economy. A policy designed to safeguard one specific industry had far-reaching detrimental effects on many others. In today's world, where supply chains span continents, it's impossible to isolate one part of the system without causing instability throughout the entire network. For the then-President Donald Trump, this tariff was a political gamble. While it may have resonated positively with his core supporters in the short term, its long-term impact on American workers was costly. For the nation as a whole, the episode offered a valuable lesson in the unintended consequences of prioritizing economic nationalism. This approach, which focuses on a country's domestic interests above all else, often fails to account for the complex global dependencies that define our current economic landscape. The aluminum tariff demonstrated that a seemingly simple protectionist measure can lead to unforeseen disruptions, higher costs for consumers, and a loss of competitiveness for other domestic industries that rely on the imported material. And for those 100,000 workers, it was something more personal. A reminder that decisions made in distant offices can change your life overnight. So the next time you hear a promise to protect American jobs with a single bold stroke, remember the story of the aluminum tariff and ask whether the cure might end up worse than the disease. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it, because understanding how these decisions ripple through our lives is the first step to making sure they don't catch us off guard again.